You see, most people who study consciousness believe wealth is about changing what you have. They visualize money, they affirm abundance, they imagine checks arriving in the mail, and they wonder why, after months of perfect technique, they're still struggling with the same financial limitations. But here's what I taught Neville in those early years on West 72nd Street. Something he rarely mentioned in his public lectures. Something so fundamental that without it, no amount of visualization will ever bring you lasting wealth. It's not about getting wealth. It's about being wealthy. Your poor self and your wealthy self cannot exist in the same mind. One must die, and you must choose which one. Most people refuse to make this choice. They want to keep their poor self comfortable while adding wealth to it, and this is why they fail. There are 7 truths about consciousness and wealth that I taught Neville. 7 shifts in identity that transform poverty into abundance through the natural expression of who you become. If you've been doing all the techniques correctly but wealth still eludes you, what I'm about to reveal will show you exactly why. My name is Abdullah. I taught these principles to Neville many decades ago in New York City on West 72nd Street. Though times have changed, though the world has transformed beyond recognition, these truths remain eternal. And in this modern age of distraction and confusion, they matter more than ever. When Neville first came to me in 1931, he was like so many of you, broke, desperate, filled with desire but empty of understanding. New York City was deep in the Great Depression, and this young dancer from Barbados arrived at my door seeking answers. I knew he was coming. The brothers had told me, and when he finally walked into that lecture hall, I looked at him and said, "Neville, you're 6 months late." He was startled. "I beg your pardon. I don't know you." "The brothers told me you would come," I said. "You're 6 months late, but you're right on time." I could see what he could not. I could see the consciousness he was living from, and I could see the consciousness he was destined to embody. That wealth is not something you acquire. Wealth is something you are. Most teachers focus on technique, how to visualize, how to feel, how to imagine, but these are useless if you are trying to add wealth to a poverty consciousness. It would be like pouring pure water into a vessel filled with mud. No matter how pure the water, it becomes contaminated. And so I taught Neville something that requires great courage, something that makes most people turn away in fear. You must find self, discover the consciousness you currently inhabit, and then you must deliberately change that self, not improve it, not polish it, but let it die completely and rise as someone else entirely. Let me tell you about a man who came to see Neville years later, a man who believed his entire identity had been determined by circumstances beyond his control. This man was of African descent in an America that still practiced open discrimination. He showed Neville signs as large as buildings denying him access. He had been told since birth that by the accident of his skin color, he would always be a secondary citizen. But then Neville shared with him what I had taught, that there is no power outside the mind of man, that he had consented to these restrictions through his consciousness, and that he could change his consciousness and therefore change his world. The man wrestled with this truth for nearly 3 years, but he persisted, and when Neville saw him again, the transformation was complete. 4 excellent office locations had been offered to him. "Neville," he said, "this year I will net $250,000. From believing he was condemned to poverty by birth, to netting $250,000 per year, not through better technique, not through harder work, but through complete identity transformation. This is what I'm going to teach you. The 7 truths that transformed that man, the same truths that can transform you. But I must warn you, this requires complete honesty about who you currently are, and the willingness to let that self die. Are you ready? The first truth: consciousness determines everything. Most people believe circumstances determine consciousness. They think, when I have money, then I'll feel wealthy. But this is backwards. Consciousness determines circumstances. Always. When Neville wanted to travel to Barbados, he had no money. His family was far away. He saw no path. And I said to him, "You are in Barbados. Not you will be, but you are. He looked at me as if I had gone mad. I'm standing here on 72nd Street. I'm nowhere near Barbados. That, I told him, is your problem. You are trying to go to Barbados, but consciousness doesn't travel. Consciousness is, and you must be in Barbados before your body can follow. Your current financial situation is not the cause of your poverty consciousness. Your poverty consciousness is the cause of your financial situation. I told Neville, you must first start with self. Find self. Don't be ashamed of the being you are. Discover it and start the changing of that self. Are you living from scarcity? Do you check your bank account with anxiety? Do you feel tightness when bills arrive? These are not random feelings. These are the natural expression of poverty consciousness. Wealthy people don't experience these feelings. Not because they have money, but because they are wealthy in consciousness. The man who nets $250,000 per year doesn't worry about the electric bill, not because he can afford it, but because worry about such things is not part of his consciousness. So, observe yourself honestly. Watch your inner conversations about money. Notice the automatic thoughts that arise. These thoughts reveal your current state, and until you see them clearly, you cannot change them. But here's what will set you free. That poverty consciousness is not you. It is simply a state you have been occupying. You are not poor. You are consciousness itself, temporarily identifying with poverty. And consciousness can always choose to identify with something else. The second truth, two selves cannot coexist. This is where most people fail. They want to keep their poor self comfortable while adding wealth to it. It cannot be done. Your poor self has its own logic, its own beliefs, its own reactions. It knows how to survive in poverty. It finds security in frugality. Your wealthy self operates on completely different principles. It doesn't hoard. It flows. It doesn't worry. It expects. These two consciousness states are incompatible. They cannot occupy the same mind simultaneously. I told Neville, when you return from Barbados, you will have died. The Neville who wanted to go to Barbados had to die so that the Neville who was already in Barbados could emerge. This is what must happen with wealth. Your poor self must die, completely, not improved, not educated, but released entirely. And this terrifies most people, because they have become so identified with their poor self that letting it die feels like actual death. Your poor self was never really you anyway. It was simply a collection of beliefs you accepted over time. But consciousness is infinite. It can take on any identity. Right now, there exists a version of you who is financially abundant. That version thinks differently, speaks differently, moves through the world differently. That version doesn't check prices compulsively, doesn't feel anxiety about money, doesn't play small to avoid risk, and you don't need to create that self. You simply need to become it. But to become it, your current self must die. The beliefs that have kept you safe in poverty must be released. The habits of scarcity must be abandoned. The identity of struggle must be laid down. Yes, this is frightening. The known self clings to its existence. It will fight for survival. It will tell you, this is foolish. You need to be practical. You can't just pretend to be wealthy when you're not. But that voice is the poor self, defending its existence, fighting against its death. You must choose. Will you listen to that voice and remain poor, or will you let that self die and rise as someone new? You cannot have both. The third truth, identity transformation requires practice. Identity transformation requires practice, daily practice, moment-by-moment practice. You must train yourself to think from your wealthy self, to react from your wealthy self. Let me tell you about a woman who understood this perfectly. She was 55 years old, unemployed, no support, behind on rent. Her bank account was nearly empty. She had attended Neville's lectures and understood the principle. But she was overwhelmed by all the things she needed. Then she remembered something essential. Instead of imagining every single thing, she decided to practice one feeling, the feeling that something wonderful was happening to her right now. Every night as she fell asleep, she would say to herself, "Isn't it wonderful? Something marvelous is happening to me now." She didn't strain, she didn't force. She simply practiced assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled. She did this every single night for 2 months. Then one day, through what seemed like a casual conversation with a friend, an entire sequence of events unfolded. Within weeks, she received an unexpected check for $2,500. Then news of a permanent income for life. But here's what you must understand. The manifestation wasn't the miracle. The practice was. Every night, she chose to occupy the consciousness of someone to whom wonderful things were happening. Every night, she let her poor self die a little more. This is the practice. This is the work. You must practice being your wealthy self before conditions confirm it. When you look at your bank account, how does your wealthy self respond? Without anxiety, without fear, with calm knowing that money flows constantly. At first it will feel like pretending. Your poor self will whisper, "This is fake. You're lying to yourself." But you are not lying. You are practicing. You are training consciousness to occupy a different state. Just as an actor practices a role until it becomes natural, you practice your wealthy identity until it becomes who you are. And the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. Until one day, you realize you're no longer practicing. You've actually become this person. The poor self has died. The wealthy self has fully emerged. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Abdullah, this sounds beautiful, but how do I actually practice this when everything around me contradicts it? This is a wise question, because transformation requires more than understanding. It requires practical tools. That's why there's something I want to offer you. It's called the Manifest Reset. This guide contains 5 specific resets. 5 practical shifts you can use when you feel stuck, when doubt creeps in, when you fall out of your desired state. One reset shows you how to stop forcing the feeling when visualization feels fake. Another teaches you the difference between letting go and giving up. A third reveals what to do when doubt and delay contradict your assumption. These are based on everything I taught, Neville. Everything that man who netted $250,000 practiced. Everything that woman who received unexpected abundance understood. To receive the Manifest Reset Guide free, simply comment "Reset" below right now. These resets will become your companions on this journey. Your way back to center when the poor self tries to reclaim its territory. Comment "Reset" now. Then continue listening, because what I'm about to reveal in the next 4 truths is even more transformative. The 4th truth: your identity creates your evidence. This is perhaps the most important truth, and the one that confuses people most deeply. Most people wait for evidence before they change their consciousness. They think, "Show me the money, then I'll feel wealthy." But consciousness doesn't work that way. Consciousness creates evidence. It doesn't respond to evidence. Let me tell you about my own students in New York. Doctors, lawyers, bankers, people from every walk of life. They sought an audience with me, and everyone who came thought themselves honored to be admitted to my home. If I was invited anywhere, I was always the honored guest. Why? Not because of what I had in the material world, but because of the consciousness I embodied. People could feel the state I lived from. And this is what I taught Neville. Your consciousness broadcasts constantly. Others feel it. Circumstances respond to it. Reality molds itself to match it. When that man came to Neville believing he was condemned to secondary citizenship, his consciousness was broadcasting poverty and limitation, and the world reflected it perfectly. The discrimination he experienced was real. The signs denying him access were physically present, but they existed because his consciousness had called them into being. And when he changed his consciousness, when he let that identity of limitation die and rose as someone who deserved abundance, the entire world around him transformed. Not because he fought against discrimination, but because he stopped broadcasting the frequency of victimhood and started broadcasting the frequency of power. Within 3 years, 4 excellent office locations were offered to him. The very world that had seemed to conspire against him now conspired to support him. And this is what you must understand about your current financial situation. Your empty bank account is not the cause of your poverty. It is the evidence of your poverty consciousness. Your debt is not what makes you poor. It is what your poverty consciousness has created. And the most dangerous trap is this. You look at this evidence and use it to confirm your identity. See, the poor self says, I am poor. Look at my bank account. This proves who I am. But it doesn't prove who you are. It proves who you were. Evidence is always delayed. It's always showing you the past. The circumstances of your life are reflecting consciousness you embodied before this moment. And if you wait for the evidence to change before you change your consciousness, you will wait forever. You will remain trapped in an endless loop. Poor evidence confirms poor identity. Poor identity creates more poor evidence. The cycle continues until you make the choice to break it. And breaking it requires understanding that consciousness is primary. Consciousness is cause. Evidence is effect. You must change consciousness first. You must die to your poor self first. You must rise as your wealthy self first. And then, only then, will evidence begin to reflect this new state. This is why I told Neville he was in Barbados when he was standing in my apartment. Because consciousness doesn't travel, it is. And when consciousness fully occupies a state, circumstances must eventually conform. But you cannot wait for circumstances to give you permission. You cannot wait for evidence to prove it's safe to change. You must change first, and trust that evidence will follow. Not because you hope it will, but because it must. Because consciousness is the only reality, and everything else is simply its reflection. This is the fourth truth, and it's the one that separates those who transform from those who remain stuck forever. Your current evidence means nothing. Your consciousness is everything. Change it, and the evidence must eventually follow. The fifth truth, natural expression, not forced effort. Once you have truly become your wealthy self in consciousness, wealth flows naturally, without effort, without strain. They think manifestation requires constant visualization, endless affirmations, exhausting mental work. But this is not how consciousness operates. When you are wealthy in consciousness, you don't need to visualize wealth. You simply live from it. A wealthy person doesn't wake up every morning visualizing money. They simply move through their day from a consciousness that expects abundance. Once Neville fully accepted that he was in Barbados in consciousness, he stopped trying to get there. He simply lived from that assumption. And then circumstances unfolded. A letter arrived. Money became available. A ship ticket materialized. All without struggle. You see, consciousness is always expressing itself. Always creating. Right now, your poverty consciousness is expressing itself naturally. You're not working hard to create scarcity. And when you become wealthy in consciousness, the same thing happens. Abundance flows naturally. That woman who received $2,500 didn't strain. She simply practiced the feeling that something wonderful was occurring. The man who nets $250,000 doesn't visualize money constantly. He simply is someone who operates at that level. This is the difference between trying to get and learning to be. So, how do you know when the transformation is complete? When you no longer need to visualize. When you no longer check whether you're feeling it right. When thinking from abundance becomes as natural as breathing. When someone mentions money and you feel nothing. No contraction. No anxiety. Just the calm naturalness of someone who already has it. This is the goal. Not to become someone who works hard at manifestation, but to become someone for whom abundance is natural. And this only happens when the old self has truly died and the new self has fully emerged. The sixth truth. You teach what you are. Whatever you are in consciousness you will attract, not what you want, not what you visualize, but what you are. Because like attracts like in consciousness, when I sat in my room on West 72nd Street, people came to me. I didn't advertise, I didn't promote myself, but they came. Because I was someone of substance in consciousness, and consciousness recognizes itself. When you transform your identity, your entire world transforms. The people you attract change. The opportunities that find you change. The circumstances that surround you change. That man who netted $250,000 per year didn't just gain money. His entire social world shifted. Different people sought him out. Different opportunities appeared. Because he was no longer broadcasting poverty consciousness. And consciousness always attracts its match. This is why you cannot fake wealth consciousness. You cannot pretend. Others will sense the truth. At the level of consciousness, they will feel what you are, and they will respond accordingly. This is also why transformation must be complete. Half measures don't work. You are either living from abundance or you're not, and what you truly are will always be revealed by what you attract. So examine your life. Look at what you're attracting, not with judgment, but with honesty. What does your current experience reveal about the consciousness you're actually embodying? Because that consciousness is broadcasting constantly, creating constantly, attracting constantly. And until you change it, truly change it at the level of identity, you will continue attracting the same patterns. But when you finally become wealthy in consciousness, you will naturally attract wealth, not through effort, but through the simple law that like attracts like. You will teach what you are. And if you are abundance, you will teach abundance to everyone and everything around you. The seventh truth, the transformation is always available. This transformation is always available, in every moment, regardless of your past, regardless of your circumstances. Consciousness exists only in the present moment. There is no past in consciousness. There is no future. There is only now. And in this now, you can be anyone you choose. The man who believed he was condemned spent 3 years transforming, but the transformation was available to him in every moment. Every time he chose his wealthy consciousness over his poor consciousness, he was transforming, and you have that same choice, right now. In this exact moment, your poor self is simply a habit of consciousness, a pattern you've practiced so long it feels like who you are, but it's just a costume you've been wearing, and you can take off that costume in this moment. When anxiety about money arises, you can choose to observe it without identifying with it. That's my poor self speaking, but I am not my poor self. When scarcity thinking emerges, you can recognize it as the old pattern. That's how my poor self thinks. But I am choosing to think as my wealthy self. These choices, repeated over and over, create the transformation. Because consciousness doesn't wait. It doesn't gradually become. It is, in each moment, whatever you choose. Yes, circumstances take time to conform. But the transformation of consciousness happens instantly. The moment you choose your wealthy identity, you have transformed. The moment you occupy abundance consciousness, you are wealthy. Not in manifestation yet, but in the only place that matters, in consciousness itself. So right now, in this moment, you can die to your poor self. You can release that identity. And you can rise as your wealthy self. Not someday, but now. You simply must choose it, and then choose it again, and again, until one day you realize you're no longer choosing. You've simply become this person. Integration. So, here we are. 7 truths about consciousness and wealth. First, consciousness determines everything. Your circumstances don't create your consciousness. Your consciousness creates your circumstances. Second, 2 selves cannot coexist. Your poor self and your wealthy self cannot occupy the same mind. One must die. Third, identity transformation requires practice. You must train yourself daily to think from your wealthy self. Fourth, your identity creates your evidence. You cannot wait for proof before you change. You must change first. Fifth, natural expression, not forced effort. When transformation is complete, wealth flows naturally. Sixth, you teach what you are. You attract what you are in consciousness. Seventh, the transformation is always available. In every moment, you can choose your wealthy identity. Where do you begin? You start by becoming honest about the consciousness you currently occupy. Watch your thoughts about money. Notice your automatic reactions. Then, you make a choice. Will you continue identifying with your poor self? Or will you let it die and rise as someone new? This choice is made moment by moment, thought by thought. When scarcity thinking arises, that's my poor self, but I choose to think as my wealthy self. When anxiety appears, my poor self is afraid. But I am not my poor self. These small choices, repeated constantly, create the transformation. Yes, at first it will feel like pretending. Your poor self will protest. This is fake. Look at your actual situation. But you're not lying, you're practicing. Just as Neville practiced being in Barbados before arriving there. Just as that woman practiced feeling wonderful before anything manifested. Just as that man practiced deserving abundance before wealth appeared. They occupied the consciousness of abundance while evidence still reflected lack. And because they persisted, reality eventually conformed. This is your path as well. Because consciousness is the only reality, everything else is its shadow. And when consciousness fully occupies a new state, circumstances must eventually match it. So I ask you, which will you choose? Will you remain identified with your poor self? Or will you choose to become someone new? Will you wait for evidence before you change? Or will you change first and trust that evidence must follow? The choice has always been yours. In every moment, your poor self and your wealthy self both exist as possibilities. You simply choose which one to occupy. And when you finally choose to let the poor self die and rise as your wealthy self, something miraculous happens. You become someone new, and that someone creates a new world. This is what transformed that man from poverty to $250,000 per year. This is what transformed that woman from desperation to abundance. And this is what will transform you. Through complete identity transformation, the death of who you were, the birth of who you choose to become. This transformation requires support. It requires practical tools for those moments when you slip back into old patterns. That's why I want to remind you about the Manifest Reset Guide. If you haven't yet commented reset below, do so now. Because this guide contains the 5 practical shifts that will help you maintain this new consciousness. Inside, you'll discover how to stop forcing the feeling when visualization feels fake. Why letting go doesn't mean giving up. What to do when doubt creeps in. How to return to your desired state when you fall out of it. These aren't theoretical concepts. They're immediate, practical resets you can use the moment you need them. When your poor self tries to reclaim its territory, these resets will guide you back. When evidence seems to contradict your assumption, these resets will remind you that consciousness is primary. When you feel like you're pretending, these resets will show you that you're simply practicing your new identity. Comment reset right now to receive free access. This guide helps people apply these eternal principles in practical ways. Based entirely on everything I taught Neville, everything he taught his students, everything that works. You don't have to struggle through the transformation without support. These 5 resets will become your companions, your way back to center, your practical tools for maintaining abundance consciousness. Comment reset below. Because transformation isn't about never falling. It's about knowing how to return to your chosen state the moment you recognize you've fallen. And these resets give you exactly that path back. Make that comment now. And before you go, there's something else you need to know. Everything I've taught you today about identity transformation, these 7 truths, there's actually a deeper secret, a specific technique I taught Neville for manifesting wealth that most people have never heard. The exact method that transformed him from unemployed dancer to financial freedom. The same principle that allowed that woman with nothing to receive $2,500 followed by lifetime income. It's called the wealth vibration secret. And I reveal exactly how it works in another teaching. That video is showing up on your screen right now. It's called The Wealth Secret Abdullah Revealed to Neville Goddard That Most People Will Never Know. Watch it next. Because when you combine these 7 truths with that specific technique, transformation becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The video is appearing now. Don't miss it.